The year is 1815. The cannons have fallen silent across Europe. Napoleon, the man who set the continent ablaze, is defeated, his grand ambitions reduced to exile on a remote island. A sigh of relief echoes from the gilded halls of Vienna to the bustling ports of London. The old order, it seems, has been restored. Monarchs and ministers gather, redrawing maps, forging alliances, and promising an era of lasting peace. Europe, bruised but triumphant, once again sees itself as the center of the world, the undisputed master of global destiny. But look closer. Beyond the celebratory waltzes and self-congratulatory speeches, the world is not what it once was. The Napoleonic Wars were more than just a clash of armies. They were a clash of ideas. The revolutionary spirits of liberty, equality, and fraternity, once uncorked, could not be so easily put back in the bottle. Across the vast expanse of the Atlantic, a new world is stirring. A world that has tasted the intoxicating brew of self-termination. This is the Americas, a vibrant, sprawling tapestry woven from countless cultures, ambitions, and dreams. From the frozen reaches of the north to the fiery tip of the south, it is a land defined by its relationship with Europe, a patchwork of colonies, territories, and fledgling nations. For centuries, this continent has been the engine of European wealth, its resources plundered, its people subjugated. The gold of the Aztecs, the sugar of the Caribbean, the furs of Canada have flowed eastward, enriching empires while chaining the Americas to a destiny not of their own making. But the chains are rattling. The chaos in Europe provided a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. While Spain and Portugal were entangled in Napoleon's web, their grip on their American colonies weakened. Cries for independencia erupted from Caracas to Buenos Aires. Men like Simon Bolivar and José de San Martin, inspired by the American and French revolutions, raised armies and declared new republics. They fought bloody, protracted wars, not just against foreign soldiers, but against loyalists, among their own people, tearing the very fabric of colonial society. Now, in 1815, this new world stands at a precarious crossroads. Independence has been declared in many places, but it is far from secure. The restored monarchies of Europe, particularly Spain, are not willing to simply let their most prized possessions go. They are regrouping, planning, and viewing these new nations as little more than rebellious provinces to be brought back under heel. The future of the Americas hangs in a fragile balance, caught between the dream of a free future and the looming shadow of an imperial past. This is a story of two worlds, old and new, locked in a dramatic struggle for control. On one side, you have the established powers of Europe, led by Great Britain, with its unrivaled Royal Navy. Britain is the globe's new policeman. It profited immensely from the turmoil, expanding its trade networks into the newly opened markets of Latin America. But its motives are complex. Does it support the new republics to keep its commercial advantages, or will it side with its fellow European monarchies to maintain the old order? London's decisions will have a ripple effect across the entire hemisphere. And what of the young United States? It is itself a grand experiment, a republic born from a successful rebellion against an empire. It looks upon the struggles of its southern neighbors with a mixture of sympathy and There's a sense of shared destiny, a Pan-American ideal. Yet, the United States is still a young, vulnerable nation, wary of being drawn into Europe's endless conflicts. It has its own immense challenges, from westward expansion to the deeply divisive issue of slavery. It is a nation trying to find its own voice on the world stage. a voice that could either champion the cause of liberty across the Americas or retreat into isolation. In the palaces of Madrid and Lisbon, there is denial and a thirst for revenge. Kings who believe in their divine right to rule cannot comprehend a world where colonies can simply declare themselves free. They see Bolivar not as a liberator, but as a traitor. They are dispatching fleets and armies, determined to crush the rebellions and restore the glory of their faded empires. For them, this is not just about economics. It's about honor, tradition, and the very foundation of their power. So, the stage is set for a monumental clash that will define the 19th century. It is a conflict fought not only on battlefields, but in the corridors of power, in the counting houses of London, and in the hearts and minds of millions. It's a story of ambition, ideology, and the epic struggle to determine who will shape the future of the modern world. This is not just a tale of nations and empires, but of the fundamental question that echoed from the halls of Vienna to the plains of South America: who has the right to rule? And what does it truly mean to be free? Join us as we explore this pivotal moment in history, a time when a new world, divided yet determined, dared to challenge the old. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey into the past insightful, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter in this incredible story. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're re-stepping into a time machine and setting the dial to 1823. Let us explore the United States, a nation that's still in its youth, just 47 years old. Imagine a country brimming with potential, but also navigating the tricky waters of a world dominated by old empires. This is the America of President James Monroe, a period often called the era of good feelings. But beneath that calm surface, powerful currents were reshaping the nation's destiny. So, what did this young republic look like? Forget skyscrapers and picture a landscape that was overwhelmingly rural. Most of the country's nearly 10 million people lived on farms or in small towns. Their lives dictated by the rising and setting of the sun and the rhythm of the seasons. Cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston were bustling port hubs, but they were compact, walkable, and filled with the sounds of horse-drawn carriages clattering over cobblestone streets. The air was thick with the smell of coal, smoke, sea salt, and the ambition of a nation on the move. The United States in 1823 was a nation of contrasts. While the North was beginning to embrace the Industrial Revolution, with textile mills sprouting up along the rivers of New England, the South's economy was deeply entrenched in agriculture, particularly cotton. This white gold, as it was known, was fueling not just the Southern economy, but also the textile factories in the North and in Great Britain. This growing economic divide between North and South was a fault line that would, in the coming decades, lead to seismic shifts in American society. Politically, the nation was finding its voice on the world stage. Under President James Monroe, the fifth president and one of the last of the founding fathers to hold the office, America was projecting a new kind of confidence. The War of 1812 had been a tough lesson, but it had also forged a stronger sense of national identity. Americans were no longer just Virginians or New Yorkers. They were Americans, proud and fiercely independent. They looked west, not east, seeing a vast continent as their manifest destiny, a future waiting to be written. This westward gaze was one of the defining features of the era. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had doubled the size of the country, and the frontier was a powerful magnet, pulling people with promises of land, opportunity, and a fresh start. Families packed their lives into covered wagons and embarked on grueling journeys along trails like the National Road. They were pioneers, settlers, and adventurers, pushing the boundaries of the nation into territories that were, for many in the East, just blank spaces on a map. This relentless expansion, however, came at a great cost to the Native American tribes who had inhabited these lands for centuries. Life in 1823 was, by our standards, incredibly challenging. Without modern medicine, a simple infection could be a death sentence. Communication was slow, with news traveling only as fast as a horse could gallop or a ship could sail. A letter from Ohio to Washington, D.C. could take weeks to arrive. Yet, despite these hardships, there was an incredible sense of optimism. The American experiment, the idea of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, was still new and exciting. It felt like anything was possible. This spirit of possibility was captured in the arts and literature of the time. Authors like Washington Irving were creating uniquely American stories. Think of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, and Rip Van Winkle. Artists of the Hudson River School were beginning to paint the majestic, untamed American landscape, seeing it as a reflection of the nation's own wild and noble character. This was a country that was not just growing geographically and economically, but also culturally. It was starting to tell its own story, in its own voice. But the era of good feelings wasn't without its tensions. The issue of slavery was a dark cloud looming on the horizon. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had temporarily quieted the fierce debate over whether new states should be admitted to the Union as free or slave states. But it was a fragile truce. Thomas Jefferson himself called the controversy a fire bell in the night, warning that it could signal the end of the Union. The economic, social, and moral questions surrounding slavery were becoming impossible to ignore. And it was in this very year, 1823, that President Monroe made a bold declaration that would echo through the centuries. In his annual message to Congress, he laid out a policy that would become known as the Monroe Doctrine. He warned the European powers to stay out of the affairs of the newly independent nations of the Western Hemisphere. No more colonization, no more interference. America was essentially drawing a line in the sand, declaring the Americas its own sphere of influence. It was a proud, audacious move for such a young country, a clear statement of its growing ambition and its vision for its place in the world. So, as we stand here in 1823, we see a nation at a crossroads. It's a land of farmers and factory workers, of pioneers and poets. It's a republic grappling with its founding ideals while expanding its borders. It's proud, it's cautious, it's optimistic, and it's deeply divided. The America of 1823 is a fascinating snapshot of a country in the process of becoming a young giant just beginning to realize its own strength and the immense challenges that lay ahead. It's a story of a people building a new world, full of promise and peril. Thank you so much for joining me on this trip back in time. I hope you found this glimpse into the America of 1823 as fascinating as I do. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and do you forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter in history. We'll see you in the next one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series. Last time, we left off as the United States was just beginning to find its footing, a young republic in a world dominated by ancient empires. Today, we turn our gaze south, to the vast, vibrant, and volatile lands of Latin America, where the winds of revolution are howling, threatening to tear down a colonial system that has stood for 3 centuries. This is Chapter 3, The Shadow of European Empires. Imagine the year is 1820. From the sun-scorched plains of Mexico to the icy peaks of Patagonia, a fire is spreading. This is the fire of independence. For 300 years, the mighty Spanish Empire had ruled this vast expanse with an iron fist, extracting immense wealth in gold, silver, and other resources. But the ideas that sparked the American and French Revolution's ideas of liberty, equality, and self-governance had crossed the Atlantic. They found fertile ground in the hearts of people who were tired of being ruled from a continent away. Figures like Simon Bolivar in the north and José de San Martin in the south were leading epic campaigns, marching armies over treacherous mountains and through dense jungles. City by city, region by region, the colonies were breaking their chains. Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, one by one, they declared their independence. It was a domino effect of defiance, a continental struggle for freedom that was reshaping the map of the world. Spain, once the master of the Americas, was now fighting a desperate, losing battle to hold on to the last vestiges of its once unimaginable empire. Its treasury was drained, its military was stretched thin, and its authority was crumbling. The age of Spanish dominance in the New World was coming to a bloody and dramatic end. But nature and international politics abhors a vacuum. As Spain's power waned, other hungry eyes turned towards the Western Hemisphere. The great powers of Europe saw not a collection of new, independent nations, but an opportunity. A power vacuum was opening up, and they were more than willing to fill it. In the grand chess game of global dominance, Latin America was suddenly a collection of very valuable and very vulnerable pawns. Let's start with Great Britain. London had watched Spain's decline with keen interest. Britain, with its unrivaled Royal Navy and its booming industrial economy, was the world's foremost commercial power. For centuries, Spain's rigid colonial system had locked British merchants out of the lucrative Latin American markets. Now, with these new republics emerging, Britain saw a golden opportunity. They were unnecessarily interested in planting the Union Jack on new territory and dealing with the headaches of colonial administration. No, their goal was more subtle and far more profitable: economic domination. By offering loans, signing trade treaties, and flooding the newly opened ports with British goods, Britain could effectively replace Spain as the dominant economic force in the region. They could control the flow of resources and goods without firing a single shot. To the British, these new nations were not partners, but markets. It was a new kind of empire, an informal empire of trade and finance, just as powerful, and perhaps even more insidious than the old model of conquest and colonization. They supported the independence movements, not out of a love for liberty, but because free nations meant free trade, and free trade meant British profits. Then there was France, still nursing the wounds from the Napoleonic Wars and the loss of its own American territories. France was eager to restore its prestige and influence. While Britain played the long game of economic influence, some factions in Paris dreamt of a more direct approach. They saw the chaos in Spain as a chance to perhaps restore a monarchy in the New World, one friendly to French interests. Remember, after Napoleon, much of Europe had swung back towards conservative monarchy, forming what was known as the Holy Alliance, which included France, Russia, and Austria. This alliance was dedicated to crushing revolutions and upholding the divine right of kings wherever they were threatened. They looked at the Republican movements in Latin America with deep suspicion and hostility. There were whispers and plots in the courts of Europe about sending a combined fleet to help Spain put down its rebellious colonies, or even to install a European prince on a new throne in, say, Mexico or Argentina. For France, it was a matter of both ideology-crushing, dangerous republicanism and strategic advantage. A French-aligned bloc in the Americas would be a powerful counterweight to both British and American influence. The threat of French warships appearing off the coast of Caracas or Buenos Aires was very real. And we can't forget the great, enigmatic power to the East, Imperial Russia. It might seem strange to think of Russia as a player in the Americas, but at this time, its reach extended further than you might think. From its bases in Alaska, the Russian-American Company had been pushing south for decades, establishing trading posts and settlements all the way down the Pacific coast, even building a Fort Ross just north of San Francisco in what was then Spanish California. Tsar Alexander I was a leading figure in the Holy Alliance and a staunch opponent of revolution. The Russians viewed the crumbling of the Spanish Empire with alarm. Their immediate interest was securing their own foothold on the Pacific coast of North America and preventing any other power, particularly the British or the upstart Americans, from dominating the region. While a full-scale Russian invasion of Latin America was unlikely, their presence on the continent was a clear signal. The Tsar made it known that he supported Spain's right to its colonies and would view the rise of independent republics with displeasure. This Russian pressure from the north added another layer of complexity and danger to the situation, a shadow stretching all the way from St. Petersburg to the sunny coasts of California and beyond. So, let's step back and look at the whole picture. In the south, a continent is in the throes of a revolutionary birth. Spain, the old master, is bleeding out, and circling like sharks are the great European powers. Britain, with its web of trade and finance, ready to ensnare the new nations in economic dependency. France, with its dreams of restoring monarchical order and its own lost glory. And Russia, the conservative giant, casting a cold eye from its Alaskan perch. The future of the entire Western Hemisphere hung in the balance. Would these new nations be able to secure their hard-won independence? Or would they simply trade one colonial master for another? It was into this volatile high-stakes international arena that the United States, itself still a young and vulnerable nation, was about to step. The events unfolding to the south were not a distant curiosity. They were a direct threat to America's own security and its vision for the future of the hemisphere. The shadows of European empires were looming large, and Washington knew it had to act. The stage was set for a bold, game-changing declaration that would echo through the centuries. And that is where we will pick up next time. The story of how the United States responded to this crisis, and how it drew a line in the sand against the old powers of Europe, is a pivotal moment in the history of the Americas. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next chapter. Your support makes all of this possible. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're venturing south into the heart of a continent ablaze with the fires of revolution. This is Chapter 4, The Voice of Independence, Latin America's Struggle. For centuries, the vast and resource-rich lands of Latin America were under the firm grip of Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule. But as the 18th century gave way to the 19th, whispers of change grew into a roar. The successful American and French revolutions had sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, planting the seeds of liberty in the minds of a new generation. People began to question the old order. Why should their destinies be dictated by kings an ocean away? The spark finally ignited in the early 1800s when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain and Portugal. With the mother countries in turmoil, their grip on the colonies weakened. This was the moment, the window of opportunity that patriots and dreamers had been waiting for. It was time to fight for their own future. In the north of South America, a figure of monumental importance emerged, Simón Bolívar. Born into a wealthy Creole family in Venezuela, Bolívar was a visionary, a brilliant military strategist, and a passionate advocate for a united, independent South America. He wasn't just a general. He was an intellectual who dreamed of a grand republic, a grand Colombia that would stretch from the Andes to the Caribbean. His journey was anything but easy. Bolívar faced crushing defeats, treacherous terrain, and constant political infighting. He was exiled only to return with renewed determination. His legendary crossing of the Andes in 1819 is a feat of military genius and sheer human endurance. He led his ragtag army of patriots, poorly clothed and half-starved, through frozen, treacherous mountain passes, to surprise the Spanish forces at the Battle of Boy. This victory was a turning point, securing the independence of what would become Colombia. From there, his momentum was unstoppable. Victory after victory followed, liberating Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, and leading to the creation of a new nation, Bolivia, which was named in his honor. Bolívar, hailed as su libertador, or the liberator, had forever changed the map of the continent. He envisioned a brotherhood of nations, free from foreign domination, and working together for a common prosperity. While Bolívar was liberating the north, another great hero was rising in the south, José de San Martín, an Argentine-born officer who had served in the Spanish army. San Martín returned to his homeland with a singular goal: to expel the Spanish from South America. Unlike Bolívar's fiery, charismatic style, San Martín was a master of strategy and discipline, a quiet and methodical planner. He understood that to secure Argentina's independence, he had to neutralize the Spanish stronghold in Peru. His plan was audacious. Instead of a direct frontal assault, he decided to do the unthinkable: lead his army of the Andes across the highest peaks of the mountain range into Chile. Just imagine the scene. Thousands of soldiers, cannons, and livestock, scaling icy cliffs and navigating narrow passages at altitudes that would leave you breathless. Many didn't make it. But in Ipaisi, San Martin's army descended into Chile, surprising and defeating the Spanish at the Battle of Chile. With Chile liberated, San Martín set his sights on the ultimate prize, Peru, the heart of Spanish power. He organized a naval expedition and landed on the Peruvian coast. After a series of calculated campaigns and political maneuvering, he entered the capital, Lima, and declared Peru's independence in 1821. He became the protector of Peru, laying the groundwork for a new government. Now, imagine this: two legendary liberators, Bolívar and San Martín, one coming from the north, the other from the south, their paths destined to cross. They finally met in the coastal city of Guayaquil in 1822. This historic private meeting has been the subject of speculation for centuries. No one knows exactly what was said behind those closed doors. But what we do know is the outcome. After the conference, San Martín, in an incredible act of humility and pragmatism, stepped aside. He resigned his command, left Peru, and sailed for Europe, leaving Bolívar to complete the final liberation of South America. San Martín believed that a unified command under one leader was essential for victory, and he put the cause of independence above his own personal glory. Of course, Bolívar and San Martín were not alone. Countless other heroes fought and sacrificed for freedom. Figures like Bernardo O'Higgins in Chile, Antonio José de Sucre, Bolivar's most trusted general, and the many indigenous and mixed-race soldiers who formed the backbone of the patriot armies. Their stories are woven into the very fabric of their nations. These independence movements were a complex tapestry of ideals, ambitions, and brutal warfare. The path to freedom was paved with immense sacrifice. Entire cities were ravaged, economies were shattered, and a generation of young men was lost to the battlefield. The dream of a single, unified South America, as envisioned by Bolívar, ultimately fractured into a collection of independent nations, each with its own challenges and identity. Back in the United States, news of these revolutions was met with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Americans, having won their own independence just a few decades earlier, naturally sympathized with their Southern neighbors' struggle for liberty. They saw a reflection of their own revolution. There was a sense of shared destiny, of a hemisphere breaking free from the shackles of European colonialism. However, this hope was tinged with fear. The great powers of Europe, the so-called Holy Alliance of monarchies, were not pleased. They saw these revolutions as a dangerous threat to the established order. There was a very real concern that France or Spain, perhaps with the help of others, would attempt to reconquer the newly independent nations. This fear spurred the United States into a bold diplomatic move. In 1823, President James Monroe issued a declaration that would echo through the centuries. Known as the Monroe Doctrine, it was a clear warning to Europe. The Americas were no longer open for colonization. Any attempt by a European power to interfere in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere would be seen as a hostile act against the United States itself. While the U.S. at the time didn't have the military might to fully enforce it, this doctrine marked a pivotal moment. It was a declaration of hemispheric independence, with the young United States positioning itself as the protector of the newly free nations of Latin America. It was America's assertion on the world stage, a statement that the new world was forging its own path, separate from the old. The liberation of Latin America was a monumental chapter in the story of freedom. It was a struggle defined by towering figures like Bolivar and San Martin, by epic military campaigns across the world's most dramatic landscapes, and by the unyielding desire of millions for self. While the road ahead would be difficult, filled with civil wars and political instability, the chains of colonial rule had been broken forever. The voice of independence had been heard, and a continent was reborn. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. If you found the story as inspiring as I did, please give this video a thumbs up. And do you and forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next adventure into the past. We'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome back to our series. In our last chapter, we left off with negotiations hitting a bit of a stalemate. Today, in chapter 5, we're diving into a pivotal moment, Britain's game-changing proposal for a joint declaration. This wasn't just another document. It was a strategic masterstroke designed to break the deadlock and chart a new course forward. So, what exactly was this joint declaration, and why did it become the key to unlocking the future? Let's get into it. By mid-1983, the mood in the negotiation rooms was tense. Both sides were dug in, and progress had slowed to a crawl. The initial rounds of talks had exposed deep-seated differences in perspective. Britain needed a way to bridge the gap, to find common ground without compromising its fundamental principles. The challenge was immense. How do you create a framework that satisfies two vastly different viewpoints while ensuring a stable and prosperous future? The answer, as it turned out, was to think outside the box. Enter the concept of a joint declaration. Instead of a one-sided agreement or a traditional treaty, The British team, led by their sharpest diplomatic minds, proposed a completely different format. This would be a shared statement, a solemn promise made by both governments to the international community. The idea was to create a document that wasn't just about handing something over, but about jointly guaranteeing a future. It was a brilliant piece of diplomatic maneuvering. By framing it as a mutual commitment, it allowed both sides to present the outcome as a shared success, rather than a win for one and a loss for the other. So, what were the core components of this proposed declaration? At its heart, it was built on a few key pillars. First and foremost, it would officially set out the terms and the timeline. No more ambiguity. Second, it would detail the basic policies that would be implemented in the period leading up to and following the transition. This was crucial for maintaining confidence and stability. It wasn't just about the what, but also the how. The British proposal emphasized continuity, that the existing systems, lifestyles, and freedoms would be preserved for a long time to come. This concept of continuity was the secret sauce. The British negotiators understood that for the plan to be accepted, people needed reassurance. They needed to know that their daily lives wouldn't be turned upside down overnight. So, the proposal for the joint declaration was carefully crafted to include specific guarantees. We're talking about guarantees for the legal system, for individual rights and freedoms, for the free market economy, and for the region's status as an international financial center. These weren't just vague promises. They were intended to be legally binding commitments enshrined in this unique international agreement. The strategic genius of proposing a joint declaration was that it shifted the entire dynamic of the negotiations. It moved the conversation away from a zero-sum game of sovereignty versus administration and towards a collaborative effort of how do we best guarantee the future. This new approach forced both sides to focus on the practical outcomes and the long-term well-being of the people involved. It was a call to look beyond historical grievances and focus on building a pragmatic and workable solution. Now, presenting this idea was one thing. Getting the other side to agree to it was another challenge entirely. The initial reaction was, as you can imagine, cautious. Was this a genuine attempt to find a solution, or was it just another diplomatic tactic? Trust had to be built. The British side spent considerable effort explaining the rationale behind the joint declaration. They argued that this format offered the best way to secure international support and provide the concrete, long-term assurances that everyone wanted. Over several rounds of intense discussions, the merits of the proposal began to sink in. The idea of a shared, internationally recognized agreement started to look more and more appealing. It offered a level of certainty that previous proposals had lacked. It also provided a clear and transparent roadmap, which was essential for calming public anxiety and securing the confidence of the international business community. The proposal wasn't just a document. It was a comprehensive plan for a peaceful and orderly transition. The structure of the proposed declaration was also meticulously planned. It would consist of the main text, the declaration itself, which would be a relatively concise statement of principles agreed upon by both governments. But the real detail would be in the annexes. These annexes would spell out, in black and white, the specific policies and arrangements. Annex: I would elaborate on the basic policies for the future. Annex 2 would cover the establishment of a joint liaison group to oversee the transition. And Annex 3 would address the important issue of land leases, ensuring a smooth continuation of property rights. This structure was incredibly clever. It allowed the main declaration to be a powerful and symbolic political statement, while the annexes provided the legally binding, technical details that lawyers, businesses, and the public needed for assurance. It separated the political symbolism from the practical implementation, making the entire package more palatable and easier to understand. This detailed, multi-part structure demonstrated that Britain had truly thought through the complexities and was serious about creating a robust and lasting agreement. And so, the stage was set. The British proposal for a joint declaration was on the table. It was a bold, innovative, and deeply pragmatic approach to one of the most complex diplomatic challenges of the 20th century. It represented a fundamental shift in strategy and paved the way for the breakthrough that was so desperately needed. The focus was no longer on winning an argument, but on building a future. In our next chapter, we'll explore the intense negotiations that followed this proposal, as both sides worked line by line through the draft text to hammer out the final agreement. The path was far from smooth, but the foundation laid by this proposal for a joint declaration proved to be the key that would ultimately unlock the door to a historic accord. It was a testament to the power of creative diplomacy. Thanks so much for watching. If you're finding this series informative, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss Chapter 6. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a period Thomas Jefferson himself called the most momentous since independence. We're talking about his presidency, a time of massive change, deep contradictions, and a vision that would forever shape the American landscape. So, grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's explore the era of Jeffersonian democracy. When Jefferson took the oath of office in 1801, it was more than just a change of leadership. It was billed as the Revolution of 1801. After the Federalist era under Washington and Adams, which favored a strong central government and commercial interests, Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans promised a return to the true spirit of the American Revolution. Their vision? An agrarian republic, a nation of independent, landowning farmers who were the bedrock of liberty. Jefferson immediately set out to dismantle the Federalist system. He slashed the national debt, cut taxes, and dramatically reduced the size of the military. He believed a large standing army was a threat to freedom, and that a simple, frugal government was the best government. This was a radical departure. He pardoned those imprisoned under the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts and worked to shrink the influence of the federal government in the daily lives of its citizens. He wanted to create what he called an empire of liberty, but one built on small government principles. It was a bold experiment, and the world was watching. But running a country is rarely as simple as an ideal. Jefferson, the champion of strict constitutional interpretation, soon found himself facing a dilemma that would test his principles to their very core. In 1803, an incredible opportunity landed on his desk. Napoleon Bonaparte, needing funds for his European wars, offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory to the United States. We're talking about 828,000 square miles of land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. The price, a mere $15 million, about 3 cents an acre. It was a deal that would literally double the size of the country overnight. But there was a huge problem. The Constitution said nothing about the federal government having the power to purchase foreign territory. Jefferson, the man who had argued for years against the Federalists' expanding government power, was in a bind. Did he stick to his strict constitutional principles and risk losing this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the nation? Or did he bend his own rules for the greater good? In the end, Jefferson chose to act. He justified the Louisiana Purchase as a treaty power, a pragmatic move that he believed was essential for the nation's future security and prosperity. He envisioned this vast new territory as the space needed for his agrarian society to flourish for generations. He sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on their legendary expedition to explore this new land, to map its rivers, catalog its resources, and establish American presence. This single decision, while constitutionally questionable by his own standards, was arguably the most significant achievement of his presidency, fundamentally altering the destiny of the United in a way no one could have predicted. However, Jefferson's presidency wasn't just about expansion. The world was a chaotic place, and America was caught in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France. Both superpowers were harassing American ships on the high seas. The British were particularly notorious for the practice of impressment, forcibly seizing American sailors and forcing them into service in the Royal Navy. It was a violation of American sovereignty and an insult to the young nation. Jefferson wanted to avoid war at all costs. He believed in what he called peaceable coercion. Instead of firing cannons, he would use America's economic power as a weapon. This led to the Embargo Act of 1807. The idea was simple. By cutting off all American trade with the rest of the world, he would force Britain and France to respect American neutrality. If they depended on American goods, surely they would have to change their policies, right? Well, the Embargo Act was an absolute disaster. It did little to harm Britain or France, who found other sources for their goods, but it crippled the American economy. New England's shipping industry came to a standstill. Southern farmers had no one to sell their cotton and tobacco to. Smuggling became rampant, and discontent grew across the nation. The act, meant to protect American interests without bloodshed, ended up inflicting more economic damage on the United States than any foreign power had. It was a powerful lesson in the complexities of foreign policy and the limits of economic warfare. The embargo was eventually repealed, just as Jefferson left office, a clear failure of one of his core policies. Beyond the grand stage of politics and diplomacy, Jefferson's presidency was also a reflection of his own complex and often contradictory character. He was the man who wrote that all men are created equal, yet he was a lifelong slaveholder. He owned hundreds of enslaved people at his Monticello plantation, and he never freed them, not even upon his death. This is the central paradox of Jefferson, a visionary for liberty who participated in the institution of slavery. We cannot talk about his presidency without confronting this uncomfortable truth. His vision of an empire of liberty was, for millions of enslaved African Americans, a hollow promise. It's a stark reminder that the ideals of the founding generation were deeply intertwined with profound injustice. As Jefferson's second term came to a close, he was ready to retire. He had faced immense challenges, from constitutional crises and foreign entanglements to economic turmoil. He had expanded the nation's borders in an unprecedented way, but had also seen the limits of his own ideals when put into practice. He left office, leaving the nation larger, but also more divided, and facing an uncertain future with Britain, which would soon erupt into the War of 1812 under his successor, James Madison. So, when Jefferson called his time in office the most momentous since independence, he wasn't exaggerating. His presidency set the United States on a new course. The Louisiana Purchase defined America's continental destiny. The Revolution of 1801 established a tradition of peaceful transfers of power and a lasting debate over the role of the federal government. But it was also an era that highlighted the deep hypocrisies at the heart of the young republic. Jefferson's legacy is one of brilliant vision and profound failure, of expanding freedom for some while denying it to others. Understanding his presidency is key to understanding the complex and often contradictory story of America itself. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the Jeffersonian era. What do you think was Jefferson's biggest success or failure? Let me know in the comments below. And if you learned something new today, please hit that like button and subscribe for more history content. We'll see you in the next chapter. Welcome back to our journey through history, where we explore the moments and movements that shaped our world. Today, we're diving into a fascinating topic: the immense power wielded not by the sword, but by the pen. Chapter 9. The Pen and the Power. Have you ever stopped to think about how a simple collection of words on a page can topple empires, spark revolutions, and change the course of human destiny? It sounds dramatic, but it's the absolute truth. Throughout history, the written word has been one of the most potent forces for change, a tool that can build consensus, expose injustice, and inspire millions. Let's start with one of the most powerful examples: the pamphlets of the American Revolution. Think about Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Before its publication in 1776, the idea of complete independence from Britain was a radical, fringe concept for many colonists. They were angry, yes, but breaking away entirely. That was a huge leap. Paine's genius was in his language. He didn't write for the elite, the scholars, or the politicians. He wrote for the common person, the farmer, the blacksmith, the merchant. He used clear, forceful, and passionate prose that anyone could understand. He argued that it was simply common sense for the colonies to govern themselves. This pamphlet spread like wildfire, selling hundreds of thousands of copies in a matter of months. It transformed public opinion, turning a confused and divided populace into a unified force demanding independence. The pen, in this case, directly fueled the fire of revolution. It gave people the language and the logic to articulate their desire for freedom. But the pen isn't just a tool for revolution. It's also a crucial instrument for building new societies. Consider the Federalist Papers. After the Revolutionary War, the newly formed United States was a mess. The initial governing document, the Articles of Confederation, was weak and ineffective. The country was on the verge of collapse. So, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay took up their pens. They wrote a series of 85 essays, published in newspapers, arguing for the ratification of a new constitution. These weren't just political arguments. They were brilliant, in-depth explorations of governance, power, and human nature. They explained how the proposed system of checks and balances would prevent tyranny, how a strong central government could provide stability, and how the rights of the people would be protected. The Federalist Papers are a master class in political persuasion. They methodically broke down complex ideas and presented a compelling vision for the future. They convinced a skeptical nation to embrace a new, untried form of government, laying the foundation for the United States as we know it today. Of course, the power of the pen isn't limited to politics. It's also a profound force for social change. Let's look at the abolitionist movement. Writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe, with her groundbreaking novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, exposed the brutal reality of slavery to a wider audience, particularly in the North. Before her book, many people might have seen slavery as a distant, abstract political issue. But Stowe's story made it personal. She created characters Uncle Tom, Eliza, little Eva that readers cared about. They felt their pain, their fear, and their hope. The novel was an emotional bombshell. It humanized the enslaved and demonized the institution of slavery in a way that political speeches never could. It's famously said that when Abraham Lincoln met Stowe, he greeted her as the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war. While that might be an oversimplification, It speaks to the incredible impact her novel had on public sentiment, galvanizing the abolitionist cause and pushing the nation closer to a reckoning. Moving into the 20th century, the pen continued to challenge injustice. Think of the investigative journalists, often called muckrakers. Writers like Ida Tarbell took on the massive corporate monopolies of her time. Her series of articles, The History of the Standard Oil Company, was a meticulous, detailed expose of John D. Rockefeller's ruthless business practices. She spent years digging through documents and conducting interviews, piecing together a story of corporate greed and corruption. Her writing led to a public outcry and eventually contributed to the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to break up the Standard Oil monopoly. Her pen held immense power accountable, and this power transcends borders and cultures. Think of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag Archipelago in the Soviet Union. The state controlled all information. The truth of the brutal labor camps, the gulags, was a closely guarded secret. Solzhenitsyn, a former prisoner himself, painstakingly collected the stories of hundreds of fellow inmates. He wrote in secret, risking his life and freedom. His monumental work was a detailed, horrifying account of the Soviet penal system. When it was smuggled out and published in the West, it shattered the illusions some held about the Soviet Union. It was a testament to the truth, a memorial for millions of voiceless victims. The pen became a weapon against the totalitarian regime, exposing its lies to the entire world. Even in our modern digital age, the principle remains the same. The pen might now be a keyboard, the paper, a blog post, a tweet, or a video script like this one. But the power to inform, persuade, and inspire is stronger than ever. Movements can be sparked by a single hashtag. Injustices can be exposed through a viral video. Personal stories shared online can create global communities of support and action. The pen gives a voice to the voiceless. It allows ideas to cross borders and generations. It can hold the powerful to account, build new worlds from the ashes of old ones, and remind us of our shared humanity. From the revolutionary pamphlets of the 18th century to the blogs and social media posts of the 21st, the written word remains an undefeated champion of change. It proves that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a bomb or a bullet, but an idea, clearly expressed and passionately shared. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration of the power of the pen. It's a reminder that our own words, our own stories, have the potential to make a difference. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what you think is the most powerful piece of writing in history. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep learning. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into pivotal moments in history. Today, we retackling Chapter 11 and getting to the absolute heart of a policy that shaped the Western Hemisphere for centuries. The Monroe Doctrine. What was it really about, beyond the name? Well, it boils down to 3 core principles, and we're going to unpack each one right now. So, picture this. It's the early 1820s. Latin American nations are winning their independence from Spain and Portugal. The world map is changing fast. European powers, fresh off the Napoleonic Wars, are looking around, maybe thinking about reclaiming old territories or grabbing new ones. In this atmosphere, the United States, still a relatively young nation, decides to draw a line in the sand. This brings us to the first and most famous principle. The Americas are no longer open to future colonization by any European powers. It was a bold declaration. The U.S. was essentially telling the powerful empires of Europe, Look, the era of planting your flag on this side of the world is over. What's here is here, but there will be no new colonies. This was a statement of hemispheric independence, a sign that the New World was charting its own course, free from the imperial ambitions of the Old World. It was like putting up a giant no vacancy sign across 2 continents. Now, you might be thinking, okay, no new colonies, but what about the countries that had just fought for their freedom? That's where the second principle comes in, and it's even more assertive. The doctrine stated that the United States would consider any attempt by a European power to oppress or control any nation in the Western Hemisphere as a hostile act against the United States itself. Think about that for a second. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was a warning. The U.S. was positioning itself as a protector of these newly independent Latin American republics. If a European monarchy tried to meddle in the affairs of, say, Colombia or Mexico, or tried to reimpose its rule, America would view it as a direct threat to its own peace and safety. It was a powerful message that linked the security of the United States with the sovereignty of its neighbors to the south. This principle essentially created a defensive umbrella, with the U.S. holding the handle. This might sound like the U.S. was picking a fight with all of Europe, but that leads us directly to the third crucial principle, which was designed to balance things out. The doctrine clearly stated that the United States would not interfere in the internal affairs of European nations or their existing colonies. This was the we. Woe unbother you, if you do unbother us, part of the deal. So, the U.S. wasn't going to get involved in Europe's complex web of alliances, wars, or political squabbles. If France and Prussia were at odds, that was their business. If Britain had existing colonies, like Canada or in the Caribbean, the U.S. was not going to challenge their status. This principle of non-interference was critical. It showed that the doctrine wasn't about American aggression in Europe. It was about American and hemispheric defense. It was a policy of 2 spheres, each minding its own business. Europe handles Europe, and the Americas handle the Americas, with the U.S. acting as the lead security guard for its hemisphere. So, let's put it all together. The Monroe Doctrine was a strategic masterpiece for its time. Principle 1. No new European colonies in the Americas, shutting the door on future imperialism. Principle 2. Any attempt to control independent nations here will be seen as a threat to the U.S., a protective stance over new republics. And Principle 3. The U.S. will stay out of European affairs, a promise of neutrality to avoid unnecessary conflict. These 3 ideas formed the foundation of U.S. foreign policy for over a century. They declared the Western Hemisphere as a distinct sphere of influence, fundamentally shaping the relationships between the United States, Latin America, and Europe. It was a defining moment where a young nation stood up and projected its vision onto the world stage. A vision that would have long-lasting and complex consequences we're still exploring today. And there you have ETHA, 3 core principles that give the Monroe Doctrine its power and significance. It is a fascinating piece of diplomatic history that set the stage for America's rise as a global power. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you found this breakdown helpful, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next chapter. We've got so much more to explore together. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our series. Last time, we explored the bold declaration that would echo through the centuries. The Monroe Doctrine, but a statement, no matter how powerful, is just words until it's tested. So, how did the old powers of Europe, the very giants Monroe was standing up to, react. That's what we're diving into today in Chapter 12, Europe's Reaction. Imagine the scene. It's 1823. In the gilded halls of London, the bustling salons of Paris, and the stately courts of Madrid, news arrives of this audacious proclamation from the upstart United States. The initial reaction? Laughter, disbelief, a collective who are these Americans, they scoffed, to tell us, the great empires of the world where we can and cannot go. To them, the United States was a young, militarily insignificant nation, barely a few decades old. It possessed a tiny army and a navy that was a mere shadow compared to the mighty fleets of Europe. The idea that this fledgling country could enforce such a sweeping policy across two entire continents seemed preposterous. It was seen as the height of arrogance, a laughable bluff from a nation punching far, far above its weight. In Paris and Madrid, especially, the doctrine was dismissed as empty posturing. These were monarchies that had just seen Napoleon's revolutionary chaos put down. They were part of the Holy Alliance, dedicated to preserving traditional monarchical rule against the rising tide of liberalism and republicanism. The newly independent nations in Latin America were, in their view, rebellious colonies that rightfully belonged under European control. They saw Monroe's declaration not just as an insult, but as an ideological challenge to their entire worldview. Their plans to help Spain reclaim its lost territories were very much on the table, and they didn't believe for a second that the United States had the muscle to stop them. But across the English Channel, in London, the reaction was more complex. Publicly, British leaders shared the skepticism of their continental counterparts. They weren't about to openly praise a doctrine that also warned them away from the Americas. Britain was the world's dominant naval and colonial power, and they weren't taking orders from Washington. However, behind the closed doors of Whitehall, the calculation was entirely different. The British had their own interests, and those interests, for the moment, aligned beautifully with America's. You see, Britain had been profiting handsomely from trade with the newly independent Latin American nations. If Spain, with the help of France, were to reconquer its old empire, those lucrative trade routes would be slammed shut. The Spanish mercantilist system would be restored, and British merchants would be kicked out. From a purely economic standpoint, an open and independent Latin America was far more valuable to Britain than a restored Spanish empire. So, while they might have scoffed at Monroe's words, they quietly agreed with his goal. The enemy of their enemy, in this case, the Franco-Spanish alliance, was their friend. This is where the story takes a fascinating turn. The United States had issued a grand warning, but it lacked the navy to back it up. Britain, however, had the most powerful navy on the planet, and while the British government never officially endorsed the Monroe Doctrine, their actions spoke louder than words. The Royal Navy, with its ships patrolling every major sea lane, became the doctrine's unintentional enforcer. Any European fleet attempting to cross the Atlantic for a reconquest of the Americas would have to face not the small American Navy, but the full might of the British Empire. And that was a fight no one in Paris or Madrid was willing to pick. It was a perfect, almost silent partnership of convenience. The Americans provided the doctrine, the grand statement of principle. The British provided the muscle, the unspoken threat that made the doctrine a reality. The U.S. got to look strong and principled, establishing its influence in the Western Hemisphere. Britain got to protect its valuable trade interests without having to make any formal, entangling alliances. It was a masterful stroke of geopolitics, where shared interests created a powerful de facto barrier around the Americas. European leaders might have laughed at President Monroe, but they couldn't ignore the silent, gray-hulled ships of the Royal Navy standing guard. This created a unique kind of security umbrella for the young United States. For much of the 19th century, America could focus on its westward expansion, its internal development, and its burgeoning industrial revolution, largely shielded from European interference in its backyard. The immense task of enforcing the Monroe Doctrine was effectively outsourced to the one nation that could actually do it. It is one of history's great ironies. A declaration aimed at keeping all European powers out was ultimately made effective by the one European power with the greatest global reach. So, while the public reaction in Europe was one of dismissal and arrogance, the private reality was shaped by hard-nosed economics and naval power. The Monroe Doctrine survived its infancy not because of American strength, but because of a convenient alignment of interests with the world's reigning superpower. The bluff had worked, not because anyone believed the United States could enforce it, but because the one country that could call the bluff had no desire to do so. It was a lesson in how international relations are often guided less by grand pronouncements and more by the quiet, calculated pursuit of national interest. And there you have it. The continent-spanning declaration from a young nation was met with laughter, but that laughter died down when the shadow of the British fleet fell across the Atlantic. It was a geopolitical game of chess, and for now, the Americans and the British were, unofficially, on the same side. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into history. It's a fascinating story of bluffs, power, and strange bedfellows. If you enjoyed this and want to continue the journey with us, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our series on the Monroe Doctrine. Last time, we explored how this bold declaration was perceived in Europe. But what about the very nations it was meant to protect? How did Latin America react to President Monroe's audacious statement? Let's dive into Chapter 13. Latin America's response. Imagine you're leading a brand new nation, fresh from a long, hard-fought war for independence. You've just thrown off the shackles of a European colonial power, and the future is both exhilarating and terrifying. Then, from the north, a young but ambitious República United States issues a grand proclamation telling the world, hands off the Western Hemisphere. What would you think? The reaction across Latin America wasn't a simple thank you. It was a complex mixture of appreciation, skepticism, and a healthy dose of realism. Let's start with the positive side. Many leaders in Latin America initially welcomed the Monroe Doctrine. It felt like a symbolic shield. Figures like Francisco de Paula Santander, the vice president of Gran Colombia, expressed cautious optimism. The United States, a fellow republic born from revolution, was seemingly standing in solidarity with its southern neighbors. The doctrine aligned perfectly with their own desires to maintain their hard-won sovereignty and prevent any European attempts to recolonize them. It was a public acknowledgement from another American nation that their independence was legitimate and should be respected. For a continent of fledgling states, this moral support from the Colossus of the North was not insignificant. It provided a sense of legitimacy on the world stage, a feeling that they weren't entirely alone in their new venture. However, this initial warmth was tempered by a strong current of pragmatism and suspicion. Latin American leaders were sharp political operators. They hadn't won their independence by being naive. They understood the realities of power in the 1820s. The United States was still a relatively young country. Its navy was small, and its army was certainly no match for the combined might of Europe's Holy Alliance. So, the big question was, could the U.S. actually enforce this doctrine? The answer, at the time, was a resounding probably not. The real muscle behind the hands-off warning wasn't the U.S. Navy. It was the British Royal Navy. As we discussed before, Britain's economic interests were deeply tied to the newly opened markets of an independent Latin America. They had no desire to see Spain or France reassert control and shut down that trade. So, Latin American leaders understood that their immediate security from European intervention depended more on London's economic policy than on Washington's political declaration. The Monroe Doctrine was a nice sentiment, but British warships were the real deterrent. This created a sense of cautious support. They appreciated the American gesture, but they didn't bank their entire future on it. It was a welcome statement, but not a security guarantee. Furthermore, there was a growing awareness of the United States' own ambitions. The doctrine wasn't purely altruistic. It was also a clear statement of American intent to be the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. Leaders like the great Simon Bolivar were wary. While he acknowledged the potential benefit of the U.S. acting as a protective older brother, he also feared that this older brother might one day become a new master. He envisioned a strong, unified Latin America, capable of defending itself and charting its own course, without relying on the goodwill of the United States. He worried that the doctrine could be a stepping stone, not to partnership, but to American dominance over the very nations it claimed to protect. This foresight was incredibly astute, as the doctrine would later be reinterpreted most famously with the Roosevelt corollary to justify U.S. intervention in Latin American affairs. So, from the very beginning, there was this dual perception: the U.S. as a potential protector, but also as a potential threat. This complex reaction can be seen in the diplomatic exchanges of the time. While there were public expressions of gratitude, there was also a push for more concrete alliances and mutual defense pacts, not just unilateral declarations. Latin American nations wanted a partnership of equals, not a relationship of dependency. For example, when the U.S. was invited to the Panama Congress in 1826, a meeting organized by Bolivar to promote a unified Latin American policy, the U.S. delegates arrived late. This small diplomatic stumble was symbolic of the larger gap in understanding and priorities. The U.S. saw the hemisphere through the lens of its own security and destiny, while Latin American nations were focused on consolidating their own independence and building regional strength. So, to summarize, Latin America's response: it was a guarded welcome. The Monroe Doctrine was seen as a positive development, a symbolic boost to their cause for independence. It put the U.S. on their side, at least in principle. However, they were acutely aware of America's limited military power to enforce it, and understood that the British Navy was their more practical shield. Most importantly, visionary leaders harbored a deep-seated suspicion about the long-term implications of the doctrine. They saw the potential for it to evolve from a protective statement into a tool for American expansionism and intervention. This cautious, multi-layered reaction reveals a sophisticated understanding of geopolitics. The new nations of Latin America were not passive recipients of U.S. policy. They were active, intelligent players on the world stage, carefully navigating their path to a secure and independent future. They accepted the symbolic support, but they never stopped looking over their shoulder, watching the ambitious republic to the north with a mix of hope and apprehension. Thank you so much for watching. We hope this gave you a clearer picture of the nuanced reactions within Latin America. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up. And do UNT forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you do UNT miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Have you ever made a big, bold statement? A declaration to the world about how things are going to be, but then didn't really have the power to back it up? Well, that's exactly the story of the Monroe Doctrine during what we call its dormant years. After President James Monroe laid down this landmark policy in 1823, telling European powers to keep their hands off the newly independent nations of the Americas, you might think the United States immediately became the hemisphere's powerful protector. But the reality was quite different. For the next several decades, the Monroe Doctrine was less of a mighty shield and more of a hopeful whisper. Let's be honest. In the mid-19th century, the United States was still a young, developing nation. We had a vast continent to settle, internal conflicts to navigate, and an economy to build. Our military, especially our Navy, was nowhere near the size or strength needed to challenge the formidable fleets of Great Britain, France, or Spain. If a major European power had truly decided to test the doctrine, to recolonize a Latin American country, there was very little the US could have done about it militarily. We simply didn't have the muscle to enforce our own rules. So, why didn't Europe just ignore it? Why didn't they call our bluff? Well, for one, their hands were full. The decades following the Napoleonic Wars were a period of immense change and instability within Europe itself. Nations were preoccupied with their own internal politics, industrial revolutions, and the complex balance of power on their own continent. Venturing across the Atlantic for new colonial projects was often too costly and too risky, especially when the potential rewards were uncertain. But there's a bigger, more ironic reason the doctrine survived. Great Britain, yes, the very power the doctrine was partially aimed at, became its unofficial enforcer. Britain, with its world-dominating Royal Navy, had its own reasons for wanting to keep other European powers out of the Americas. They weren't interested in seeing their old rivals, like Spain and France, regain a foothold and disrupt trade. Britain had established lucrative commercial relationships with the independent Latin American nations. Open ports and free trade were far more profitable for them than a return to closed-off Spanish colonies. So, in a strange twist of fate, British naval supremacy and economic self-interest aligned perfectly with American policy. While the US talked the talk, it was often the British fleet that, intentionally or not, walked the walk. The Royal Navy was the real big stick in the Atlantic, and as long as British and American interests coincided, the doctrine was safe. This created a convenient, unspoken partnership. The US could claim the principle, while Britain provided the power. This period is fascinating because it shows how diplomacy is often a game of appearances and shared interests. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't enforced by American canons, but by a combination of European distraction and British commercial ambition. It was a paper tiger, but a very effective one. Domestically, the doctrine became a cornerstone of American foreign policy identity, even if it wasn't actively applied. It was a statement of our aspirations, a symbol of our growing sense of national purpose and our self-proclaimed role as the guardian of liberty in the Western Hemisphere. It was an idea that politicians could rally around, a point of national pride. It shaped how Americans saw themselves and their place in the world long before they had the power to make that vision a reality. Think of it like a young entrepreneur writing a bold business plan. They don't have the funding or the staff yet, but the plan itself, vision guides their actions and attracts future investors. The Monroe Doctrine was America's hemispheric business plan. It was an audacious claim on the future. These dormant years were crucial. They allowed the doctrine to take root in the American political consciousness. It became an accepted, almost sacred principle. So, when the United States finally did grow into a global power towards the end of the 19th century, the foundation was already laid. The doctrine was there, waiting. It was an old ideal, ready to be supercharged with new industrial and military strength. The transition from a symbolic statement to a tool of intervention would come later, most notably with the Roosevelt corollary in the early 20th century. But that's a story for another time. For now, the key takeaway from the dormant years is this: a policy's power does always come from immediate enforcement. Sometimes, its strength lies in its symbolism, its timing, and the convenient self-interest of others. The Monroe Doctrine survived its infancy, not because America was strong, but because the world was complicated, and because our biggest rival, Great Britain, happened to want the same thing. It was a doctrine born of bravado, protected by chance, and destined for a much more muscular future. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into American history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into a powerful and often controversial idea that profoundly shaped the United States: manifest destiny. It's a concept that fueled incredible growth and expansion, but also left a complex legacy we're still grappling with today. So, what exactly is manifest destiny? The term was first coined in 1845 by a journalist named John O'Sullivan. In its simplest form, it was the belief that the United States was destined, divinely ordained, even to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. Think of it as a sense of mission, a belief that American expansion wasn't just a good idea, it was inevitable and justified. This wasn't just a political slogan, it was a cultural mindset. It captured the ambitious, restless, and sometimes arrogant spirit of 19th century America. It was fueled by a booming population, economic aspirations, and a fervent belief in the superiority of American institutions. Artists painted grand, sweeping landscapes of pioneers moving west, with angelic figures guiding them, symbolizing this divine approval. It was a powerful narrative that told Americans they were on the right side of history. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, didn't we just talk about the Monroe Doctrine? Absolutely. And this is where things get really interesting. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was essentially a hands-off warning to European powers, telling them to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Initially, it was a defensive posture. The U.S. was a young nation, concerned about European monarchies trying to reclaim former colonies in Latin America. It was about protecting American independence and the sovereignty of its neighbors. But by the mid-1800s, the United States was no longer a fragile young republic. It was growing in confidence, population, and power. This is where the Monroe Doctrine begins to merge with manifest destiny. The doctrine's original intent to keep Europe out was reinterpreted. It evolved from a defensive shield into an offensive justification. If Europe couldn't interfere, who would fill that power vacuum? The United States, of course. The new thinking went something like this: not only should Europe stay out, but it is our destiny to lead and shape this hemisphere. This ideological fusion created a potent justification for American expansion. It wasn't just about moving west into unsettled lands. It was about asserting influence over the entire region. The doctrine provided the no trespassing sign for Europe, while Manifest Destiny provided the green light for American expansion. This combination had massive, real-world consequences. Let's look at Texas. After gaining independence from Mexico in 1836, the Republic of Texas was a hot topic. Many Texans, a large number of whom were American settlers, wanted to join the United States. The debate over annexation raged for nearly a decade, tied up in complex issues like slavery and the balance of power in Congress. But the idea of manifest destiny tipped the scales. Proponents argued it was America's destiny to absorb Texas and extend its area of freedom. When James K. Polk ran for president in 1844, he did so on an aggressive expansionist platform, promising the annexation of Texas and the acquisition of the Oregon Territory. He won, and in 1845, Texas was officially annexed, becoming the 28th state. This act, driven by the spirit of manifest destiny, directly led to the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. The U.S. victory in that conflict was transformative. Through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded a vast territory that includes the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. In a single stroke, the United States stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Manifest destiny had become a reality on the map. Simultaneously, there was the Oregon Territory, which the U.S. jointly occupied with Great Britain. The popular slogan became 5440, or fight, referring to the northern latitude line of the territory. While it didn't come to a fight, the expansionist pressure led to the Oregon Treaty of 1846, which established the 49th parallel as the border between the U.S. and British Canada. Another huge piece of the continental puzzle fell into place. This relentless westward push was embodied by the pioneers who traveled the Oregon, California, and Santa Fe trails. These were grueling, dangerous journeys undertaken by hundreds of thousands of Americans seeking land, opportunity, and a new life. They were the foot soldiers of manifest destiny. They faced incredible hardships, disease, harsh weather, and difficult terrain. They were driven by a belief in a better future, a future that lay in the West. However, it's crucial that we look at this story from all angles. The land that was being settled was not empty. It was the home of hundreds of Native American nations, and had been for centuries. Manifest destiny, from their perspective, was not a divine mission. It was an invasion. The expansion led to broken treaties, forced relocations like the Trail of Tears, and violent conflicts. The narrative of progress for American settlers was a story of displacement, loss, and tragedy for native peoples. Similarly, the expansion into the Southwest meant that thousands of Mexican citizens suddenly found themselves living in a new country. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised them rights and citizenship, but in practice, many lost their land and faced discrimination. Their culture and way of life were forever changed by the arrival of Anglo-American settlers. So, as we see, manifest destiny was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it propelled the United States to become a transcontinental nation, fueling economic growth and shaping its national identity as a powerful and ambitious country. It cemented the idea that the U.S. was a leader in the hemisphere, an idea that would continue to influence its foreign policy for the next century and beyond. On the other hand, this progress came at an immense human cost. It justified the subjugation of Native Americans and the antagonizing of Mexico. It also inflamed one of the most divisive issues in American history: slavery. With every new territory acquired, the question of whether it would be a free state or a slave state tore the nation further apart, ultimately pushing it toward the Civil War. In conclusion, the mid-1800s saw the fusion of the Monroe Doctrine as keep out message with manifest destiny go west imperative. This powerful combination reshaped the map of North America and cemented America's self-perception as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. But this era of expansion is a complex chapter in our history, filled with triumphs and tragedies, ambition and injustice. Understanding it is key to understanding the America we live in today. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration. I hope it gave you some food for thought. If you found this interesting, please give this video a thumbs up. And do you forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you miss our next chapter. See you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our history series. Today, we're diving into a topic you might think you know inside and out, the American Civil War. But we're going to look at it from a completely different angle. Instead of focusing solely on the battles at Gettysburg or Antietam, we're going global. How did the world react when the United States, this beacon of democratic experiment, suddenly turned on itself? This is the story of the Civil War and the web of global tensions it created. So, it's 1861. The cannons have fired on Fort Sumter, and America is at war with itself. Across the Atlantic, the great powers of Europe, Britain, and France are watching very, very closely. Their initial reaction, a mix of shock, concern, and, let's be honest, a little bit of strategic calculation. For decades, the United States had been a rising power, a commercial rival, and a Republican experiment that many monarchies found unsettling. Suddenly, this rival was on the verge of splintering. For Britain, the situation was incredibly complex. On one hand, their textile industry, the powerhouse of their economy, was almost entirely dependent on cotton from the American South. This wasn't a small deal. We're talking about millions of jobs and a massive part of the British economy. The blockade the Union imposed on southern ports created what became known as the Cotton Famine in Lancashire. Mills closed, workers were laid off, and there was real economic hardship. This created immense pressure on the British government to intervene on behalf of the Confederacy, just to get the cotton flowing again. On the other hand, Britain had abolished slavery in its own empire decades earlier. The British public was overwhelmingly anti-slavery. So, while the aristocracy and some business leaders might have quietly sympathized with the aristocratic Southern planters, the common people were firmly on the side of the Union and emancipation. This created a powerful moral dilemma for the British government. How could they support a nation founded on the principle of slavery, even if it was economically convenient? It was a massive internal struggle. Now, let's cross the English Channel to France, led by Emperor Napoleon III. Napoleon had grand ambitions to restore French glory and influence, especially in the Americas. He saw the American Civil War as a golden opportunity. A weakened, divided United States would be unable to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, which had long warned European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. With the U.S. preoccupied, Napoleon made a bold move. He invaded Mexico, overthrew the government of Benito Juárez, and installed an Austrian Archduke, Maximilian, as the Emperor of Mexico. It was a brazen attempt to create a French puppet state right on America's doorstep. Napoleon was secretly hoping for a Confederate victory because he believed an independent Confederacy would be a friendly buffer state and a valuable ally. more willing to accept a French presence in Mexico. He even floated the idea of joint British-French recognition of the Confederacy, but the British were always too hesitant to pull the trigger. So, you have these two European giants, Britain and France, unofficially walking a diplomatic tightrope. They declared neutrality, but their actions often spoke louder. For instance, Confederate diplomats like James Mason and John Slidell were sent to Europe to lobby for official recognition and aid. Their mission was to convince these powers that King Cotton was so mighty that Europe couldn't survive without it. This led to one of the most famous diplomatic incidents of the war, the Trent Affair. In late 1861, a U.S. Navy ship intercepted a British mail steamer, the Trent, and forcibly removed Mason and Slidell. This was a violation of neutral rights, and Britain was furious. For a moment, it looked like the United States and Great Britain were on the brink of war, which would have been a disaster for the Union. President Lincoln, ever the pragmatist, understood this. He cooled tensions, released the diplomats, and wryly commented, "One war at a time." Crises averted, but it showed just how fragile international relations were. Beyond just diplomacy, there was the issue of military hardware. While officially neutral, British shipyards became the unofficial naval constructors for the Confederacy. Companies built fast, powerful commerce raiders like the CSS Alabama and the CSS Florida. These ships, sold to the Confederacy and crewed by Confederates, then went on a rampage, sinking dozens of Union merchant vessels across the globe. The CSS Alabama alone was responsible for capturing or burning over 60 Union ships. This caused immense damage to the Union's merchant marine and created another major point of friction between Washington and London. The U.S. government was furious, arguing that Britain was violating its neutrality by allowing these warships to be built and launched from its ports. But as the war dragged on, the moral dimension became impossible to ignore. The turning point on the world stage was really Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. By officially reframing the war as a fight against slavery, not just to preserve the Union, Lincoln made it almost impossible for anti-slavery nations like Britain to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. Supporting the South now meant explicitly supporting slavery. The working classes in Manchester, despite suffering from the cotton famine, famously wrote to Lincoln, supporting the Union's cause because they saw it as a struggle for human freedom. It was a powerful statement of solidarity. Even Russia played a surprising role. As a rival to Britain and France, Russia saw a strong, unified United States as a valuable counterweight in global politics. In the autumn of 1863, at a very tense moment in the war, the Russian Imperial Navy sent two fleets on goodwill visits, one to New York and the other to San Francisco. While publicly a friendly gesture, the message was clear to Britain and France. Russia supported the Union. This move discouraged any thoughts of European intervention and was a huge morale boost for the North. So, as the Union armies under Grant and Sherman began to secure decisive victories in 1864 and 1865, the world watched. The possibility of Confederate recognition faded completely. Napoleon III's adventure in Mexico began to crumble. Once the Civil War ended, the United States, now with a massive, battle-hardened army, turned its attention south. The U.S. government sent arms to the Mexican resistance and massed troops on the border. The message was unmistakable. Under this pressure, France withdrew its forces, and Maximilian's empire collapsed. He was captured and executed in 1867. The Monroe Doctrine was back with a vengeance. The end of the Civil War didn't just reunite the United States. It fundamentally reshaped its place in the world. The nation had survived its greatest existential crisis. It had abolished slavery and, in the process, navigated a treacherous international landscape where its very survival was in question. The European powers who had watched, waiting to see if the great American experiment would fail, now saw a resilient, industrialized, and unified nation, more powerful than ever before. The Civil War was not just an American story. It was a global event that tested alliances, challenged economies, and ultimately affirmed the trajectory of the United States as a dominant world power. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this gave you a new perspective on this pivotal period in history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories you thought you knew. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into Chapter 18, a pivotal moment where American foreign policy took a dramatic turn. The year is 1904, and the man at the helm is the larger-than-life figure, Theodore Roosevelt. We're talking about the birth of the Roosevelt Now, to understand the corollary, we first have to remember the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. In simple terms, it was a hands-off sign from the United States to European powers, telling them to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It was about protecting the newly independent nations of Latin America from European For nearly a century, this was the bedrock of American foreign policy in the region. But by the turn of the 20th century, the world was a different place. The United States was flexing its muscles on the global stage, having recently emerged victorious from the Spanish-American War. President Roosevelt, a man who famously advised to speak softly and carry a big stick, saw America's role in the world expanding. The immediate trigger for his new policy was a crisis brewing in the Dominican Republic. The nation was in deep financial trouble, owing massive debts to several European countries. These European creditors were getting impatient, and there was a very real threat that they might send warships to the Caribbean to forcibly collect their debts. From Roosevelt's perspective, this was a direct challenge to the Monroe Doctrine. European military presence in the Americas, for any reason, was unacceptable. But here's the twist. Roosevelt didn't just want to block Europe. He believed that if these Latin American nations were unstable and couldn't pay their debts, they were inviting European intervention. He felt that chronic wrongdoing or political instability in the Western Hemisphere might ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. And in his view, the United States was the most civilized nation in the hemisphere to do the job. So, in his annual message to Congress in December 1904, Roosevelt laid out his reinterpretation. This became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It was a radical update. He argued that the United States had the right, and indeed the obligation, to intervene in the affairs of its southern neighbors if they were unable to maintain order and pay their financial obligations. Let's break that down because it's a huge shift. The original Monroe Doctrine was a shield. It was about protecting Latin America from Europe. The Roosevelt Corollary, however, turned it into a license for the United States to act as an international police power within Latin America. The message was no longer just Europe, stay out. It was now Europe, stay out, because we'll handle any problems down here ourselves. Think of it like this. The original doctrine was like a neighborhood watch sign saying, "No outsiders allowed." The Roosevelt Corollary was like one neighbor declaring, "And if anyone in this neighborhood gets out of line, I'll be the one to step in and fix it." This transformed the U.S. from a passive protector to an active enforcer. The first major application of this new policy came almost immediately in the Dominican Republic. In 1905, the U.S. took control of the country's customs houses, the main source of government income. American agents would collect the tariffs, set aside a portion to pay off the foreign debts, and give the rest to the Dominican government to run the country. On the surface, it solved the immediate crisis. The European powers were paid, and their warships stayed away. Roosevelt saw this as a successful, responsible exercise of American power. He believed he was preventing chaos and upholding stability in America's backyard. He argued that this preemptive action was better than waiting for a European power to invade, which would create a much bigger problem. In his mind, he was acting in the best interests of both the United States and the nations he was intervening in, even if they didn't see it that way. However, from the perspective of Latin American countries, this was a massive infringement on their sovereignty. They hadn't asked for a police officer. They saw the United States not as a benevolent big brother, but as a domineering bully. The policy was deeply resented and viewed as a new form of imperialism, just trading European control for American control. This perception of Yankee imperialism would sour U.S.-Latin American relations for decades to come. The Roosevelt corollary justified numerous U.S. interventions in the early 20th century. American troops would land in Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, often for years at a time. This policy, born from a desire to maintain regional order and secure American interests, had profound and long-lasting consequences. It reshaped the power dynamics of the Western Hemisphere and defined an era of American interventionism. While later presidents, particularly Franklin D. Roosevelt, with his good neighbor policy in the 1930s, would officially renounce the Roosevelt corollary and pledge non-intervention, its legacy lingered. The idea that the U.S. had a special right to police the Americas became deeply ingrained in the mindset of many American policymakers. So, the Roosevelt corollary is a classic example of how a foundational doctrine can be reinterpreted to fit new circumstances and a new vision of national power. It marks the transition from a protective Monroe Doctrine to an interventionist one, fundamentally changing the relationship between the United States and its southern neighbors. What began as a warning to Europe in 1823 became, in 1904, a justification for the United States to wield its big stick throughout the hemisphere. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a crucial chapter of American history. It's a complex topic with a complicated legacy, and I hope this helped shed some light on it. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into Chapter 19, exploring the enduring and often controversial legacy of the Monroe Doctrine throughout the 20th century and into our modern era. How did a policy from 1823 continue to shape global events, acting sometimes as a protective shield and other times as an aggressive sword? Let's find out. When President James Monroe first declared that the Americas were no longer open to European colonization, he likely never imagined his words would echo through the centuries, becoming a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. For over 100 years, the doctrine evolved, but it was in the 20th century that it faced its most critical tests and transformations. Let's start with Theodore Roosevelt and his famous quote. At the dawn of the century, Roosevelt added a significant twist. He declared that the U.S. had the right to act as an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. This wasn't just about keeping Europe out. It was about the U.S. stepping in. This big stick diplomacy led to numerous interventions in countries like Cuba, Panama, Nicaragua, and Haiti. While the stated goal was often to stabilize the region and protect American interests, for many in Latin America, this felt less like protection and more like domination. The doctrine, once a shield against European empires, was now being wielded as a sword of American influence. This interventionist approach softened under Franklin D. Roosevelt's good neighbor policy in the 1930s. FDR pledged to respect the sovereignty of Latin American nations, moving away from military intervention and toward economic and diplomatic cooperation. This was a significant shift, an attempt to rebuild trust and present the U.S. as a partner rather than a police officer. It was a conscious effort to sheath the sword and polish the shield, emphasizing mutual respect and shared interests, especially with the looming threat of World War II. But the Cold War would change everything. Once again, the global ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union brought the Monroe Doctrine roaring back to life, but this time with a new enemy: communism. The fear wasn't European monarchies anymore. It was Soviet influence creeping into America's backyard. This brings us to one of the most terrifying moments in modern history: the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. When the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, President John F. Kennedy's administration invoked the spirit, if not the exact letter, of the Monroe Doctrine. Kennedy declared a naval quarantine around Cuba, a clear message that the U.S. would not tolerate a hostile foreign power, establishing a military foothold so close to its shores. The world held its breath for 13 days as the two superpowers stood on the brink of nuclear war. The crisis was ultimately resolved through diplomacy, but it powerfully demonstrated the doctrine's relevance. It was the ultimate test of the doctrine as a shield, protecting the hemisphere from an external threat, and Kennedy's firm stance solidified its place in Cold War strategy. Throughout the Cold War, this anti-communist interpretation of the doctrine justified U.S. involvement across Latin America, from supporting coups against democratically elected leaders suspected of leftist sympathies, like in Guatemala in 1954 and Chile in 1973, to funding anti-communist insurgent groups like the Contras in Nicaragua during the 1980s. These actions are a deeply controversial part of the doctrine's legacy. For U.S. policymakers, they were necessary steps to contain Soviet expansion. But for millions of Latin Americans, these interventions brought instability, violence, and propped up authoritarian regimes. The sword was out again, and its cuts ran deep, leaving scars of resentment and mistrust that have lasted for generations. So, where does the Monroe Doctrine stand today, after the Cold War has ended? Has it finally been retired to the history books? Not entirely. Its language and spirit continue to surface in modern diplomacy. You can hear echoes of it in discussions about foreign influence in the hemisphere, whether concerning economic investments from China, political ties with Russia, or security issues in countries like Venezuela. For example, in 2019, then National Security Advisor John Bolton explicitly stated, "The Monroe Doctrine is alive and well." This highlights the doctrine's incredible adaptability. It has been stretched, reinterpreted, and repurposed to fit the geopolitical landscape of the moment. It began as a bold declaration of hemispheric independence, transformed into a justification for intervention, evolved into a tool for Cold War containment, and now exists as a complex, often unspoken principle in 21st century foreign policy. The legacy of the Monroe Doctrine is, therefore, deeply dualistic. It is a story of a shield and a sword. As a shield, it articulated a powerful vision of a hemisphere free from outside domination and, at its best, promoted a sense of shared destiny among the nations of the Americas. It helped protect the young republics of Latin America from reconquest and was invoked to face down a nuclear threat. But as a sword, it was used to justify actions that undermined the very sovereignty it was meant to protect. It created a power imbalance that often placed U.S. interests above those of its neighbors, leading to a legacy of intervention and resentment that continues to complicate American relations today. Understanding this dual legacy is crucial. It's not a simple story of good versus evil, but a complex tapestry of ideals, power, politics, and unintended consequences. It forces us to ask difficult questions about the role of a superpower, the meaning of sovereignty, and the delicate balance between national security and international respect. The Monroe Doctrine's 200-year journey is a powerful reminder that the ideas that shape our world are rarely static. They live, breathe, and change with the times, leaving a complicated and often contested legacy in their wake. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the legacy of the Monroe Doctrine. I hope it gave you a new perspective on this pivotal piece of American history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We love hearing from you, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. As we draw the curtains on this incredible journey through the history of the Monroe Doctrine, let's take a moment to reflect. Let's step back from the dates, the names, and the specific events, and look at the bigger picture, the immense shadow this single document has cast over the last 2 centuries. It's a story that begins not with a bang, but with a warning. A simple, declarative statement born from a young nation's anxieties about its own security and the fragile independence of its neighbors. In 1823, the United States was hardly a global power. It was a regional player, looking nervously across the Atlantic at the old empires of Europe, seeing their ambitions and their seemingly endless capacity for intervention. The Monroe Doctrine was a line drawn in the sand, a message sent across the ocean. This hemisphere is no longer a chessboard for your games of power. Its destiny is its own. It was a bold, almost audacious statement for a country of its size and influence at the time. But what began as a defensive posture, a shield to protect the nascent republics of the Americas, slowly began to transform. Ideas are living things. They evolve, they adapt, and sometimes they are twisted into shapes their creators never intended. Over the decades, the doctrine morphed from a protective warning into something far more assertive. It became intertwined with the potent, intoxicating idea of manifest destiny. Suddenly, it wasn't just about keeping Europe out. It was about America's own role within the hemisphere. The shield started to look more like a scepter. The doctrine was invoked not just to deter European colonialism, but to justify American expansionism, intervention, and economic dominance. The big stick policy of Theodore Roosevelt is perhaps the most vivid illustration of this change. The protective older brother had become a disciplinarian, enforcing his will across the schoolyard of the Americas. This transformation is the core of the doctrine's complex legacy. For some, it remains a symbol of American foresight and resolve, a cornerstone of hemispheric independence that prevented the New World from being carved up like Africa or Asia. It was the moment America stepped onto the world stage and declared its principles. In this view, the doctrine was a necessary declaration that allowed the nations of the Americas the space to forge their own paths, free from the machinations of distant monarchies. But for many others, particularly in Latin America, the story reads very differently. The Monroe Doctrine became a veil, a convenient justification for what they saw as a new form of imperialism, one that was closer to home and often more insidious. It was the Colossus of the North dictating terms, intervening in their politics, controlling their economies, and overthrowing their governments when they didn't align with U.S. interests. From this perspective, the warning to Europe was simply a prelude to America, claiming the hemisphere for itself. Think about the sheer number of interventions in Cuba, Nicaragua, Panama, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala. In case after case, the Monroe Doctrine, or at least its spirit, was in the background, providing the ideological framework for actions that had profound and often painful consequences for the people living in those nations. It created a deep well of resentment and suspicion that has colored into American relations for generations. The legacy isn't just in the political maps, but in the hearts and minds of millions. Then came the Cold War, and the doctrine was repurposed once again. Now, the threat wasn't European monarchies, but the spread of communism. The enemy had a new name, but the logic remained eerily similar. The hemisphere had to be protected, this time from Soviet influence. This led to some of the most controversial chapters in the doctrine's history, from the Bay of Pigs invasion to the support for authoritarian regimes, all justified under the banner of keeping the hemisphere free from an external ideological foe. The doctrine proved to be remarkably flexible, a tool for every era's geopolitical anxieties. As we stand here today, in the 21st century, the world is a vastly different place. The age of European empires is long gone. The Cold War is a memory. The nations of Latin America are significant players on the global stage in their own right, with complex economies and diverse political landscapes. So, is the Monroe Doctrine even relevant anymore? Has it finally been relegated to the history books? The answer, like the doctrine itself, is complicated. While no president today would likely invoke it by name in the same way James Monroe or Teddy Roosevelt did, its ghost lingers. The underlying principle that the United States sees the Western Hemisphere as its primary sphere of influence has not entirely disappeared. It echoes in foreign policy debates, in trade negotiations, and in responses to political instability in the region. The core tension remains. Where is the line between being a helpful neighbor and being an overbearing power? How does the U.S. balance its own security and economic interests with the genuine sovereignty and self-determination of the other 34 nations in the Americas? This is the fundamental question that the Monroe Doctrine first raised, and it's a question we are still grappling with today. So, as we close this chapter, let's remember the Monroe Doctrine not as a single, static event, but as a living, breathing idea that has shaped our world. It began as a warning shot fired by a young republic, full of both high-minded ideals and it grew into a powerful symbol of American destiny and dominance, a justification for both protection and projection of power. It has been praised as a shield and condemned as a weapon. It changed the map of global power, not just by drawing lines on paper, but by shaping the relationships, the economies, and the very destinies of the nations of an entire hemisphere. It's a stark reminder that the words we write, the doctrines we declare, can take on a life of their own, echoing through time in ways we can never fully predict. The story of the Monroe Doctrine is, in the end, a story about power, ambition, and the enduring, complicated, and ever-evolving relationship between the United States and its neighbors. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into such a pivotal piece of history. If you found this journey as fascinating as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more content like this. It truly helps us continue to explore these incredible stories. Until next time, stay curious.